Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. And tonight, we're going to be doing a discussion which is something which is largely, I think, is largely forgotten in the grand narrative around World War II, specifically the British and Commonwealth involvement in the Pacific theatre of war. Um, and I'm joined by IronDuke. Good evening, IronDuke.
Good evening, mate. Very happy to be here.
Great, and I don't know about you, Andrew, but I think when I see in popular media and a lot of documentaries, I did like a flick through of documentaries today, like on Prime and just the things that I can just find. And whenever it's the Pacific campaigns, it's always the Americans in Midway, it's Guadalcanal, it's Okinawa, it's the Philippines and so on. And it seems that it's a very heavy American focus, and um, Burma is largely forgotten about. And the funny thing is that they became known as the Forgotten Army and later on the Forgotten War. Um, of course, in Australia, you have the New Guinea campaign, and the Australian forces there who held the Japanese throughout the war. Um, and of course, as we'll talk about, is the British naval power, which kept which was could rival the Japanese quite easily. Um, and
Oh, look,
I,
the AI, the Royal Navy in 1939 and indeed in 1941 was far bigger than the Imperial Japanese Navy. Difference was, of course, by that stage, Britain was already fighting Germany, which had a relatively small navy, and Italy, which had quite a big and powerful navy in the Mediterranean. So only certain proportions of the British fleet could be spared to fight the Japanese, which is worth mentioning.
yes, and so I mean, we'll get started. Shall we start with the Battle of Kohima and Imphal? So just to,
Hang on
or
one
do you want to
minute
start
there, AI.
the backstory? Yeah.
AI, just 1 minute. First of all, I'd like to apologize to you, AI, and also to the people in the chat. Normally speaking, I do, if I'm doing a historical stream, I spend about 4 hours before the stream brushing up on everything like I've read over the years. I haven't done this on this occasion, and the reason I haven't is because, like all good British people, I've been outraged by the greeny moron lefties from Just Stop Oil going around and vandalizing Stonehenge, the 5,000-year-old memorial in Britain. It's just another attack on English and British history and tradition and culture, as far as I'm concerned. And the only good thing I noted was that Nigel Farage is the one politician who has already come out and said these guys should go to prison, and they absolutely should, for a minimum of 6 months. Like, I think Just Stop Oil, who are completely supported by the Conservative Labour Uni Party, should this has been a mistake on their part. I think it's outraged most good British and English people.
Yes, and I just quick statement on my part on that is a lot of lefties are saying that because this was some sort of eco-friendly spray or something, rainwater can wash it off. That is not true, Iron Duke. They Just Stop Oil used the same spray at the Brandenburg Gate, I think last year, and ever since then there has still been a light orange stain in and around that region where it was used. So the idea that this can be, unfortunately, because they sprayed quite a bit of it, and it's what was very sad to see is there was a child trying to stop them.
Yeah, no, I saw that. I saw that. A good on the child, by the way. But also the other thing is those stones that were set up 5,000 years ago.
Yeah,
By
older than the pyramids.
very early English and British people.
Yeah,
they are protected by assorted mosses and lichens, and that spray paint they put on them and trying to clean it off is going to destroy them, which is going to damage the stones. It's just a fact. It is.
You know, IronDuke, I, as you know, I live in an area. I when I go to my nearby city of Bristol, every now and then I do see like stalls of Just Stop Oil. I tell you what, I'm not going to have to go, because if I go there and I see them, I'm going to end up in the police cell at the end of the day. I'm
Oh,
not
look, mate, I
joking,
tell you,
IronDuke.
if I'd have been wandering around Stonehenge today, I can absolutely assure you that the bloke who was doing that would have accidentally got an elbow in the face, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, straight up. I mean, people's kneecaps would not be working the following day. I mean, yeah,
these people are vile. They're vile lefty morons, I'm afraid. Or the only way I can describe them.
yeah. I
And
mean,
like I
it's
say, if you hate these people as much as me, vote for Farage and vote Reform, because Farage has said that Reform will remove all the net zero crap. So, yeah.
yeah. I mean, they need to be made a prescribed terrorist organization now.
Yeah, what they did to Stonehenge is
crossing a line.
It's
crossing a line.
terrorist. It's terrorist vandalism, basically.
Yes, it's crossing the line. Is terrorism. Anyway, we'll get started with the stream. So of course, on the 7th of December, as people will know, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And I'm not going to get into the debate, IronDuke, because I just don't know. I know that there's a theory that the Americans knew about the attack coming. There was a submarine that was caught in the bay at Pearl. I don't know. I don't know enough detail about that backstory to comment on it.
It's irrelevant to what we're going to talk about, I would say, largely.
Yeah. So yeah. And so at the same time of the attack there, the Japanese launched the attack on Hong Kong. They launched these very quick amphibious attacks on Indochina and Malaya, and then into Indonesia. And this was like a very, very quick, coordinated move to basically get the a surprise attack, effectively. And yeah,
I think it's worth mentioning that between 1902 and 1922, Japan was a very good and loyal ally of Britain. As a result of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, whereby Britain had to get rid of the Japanese alliance because the Royal Navy and the Japanese Navy, well, in fact, the Royal Navy on its own in 1922 was vastly bigger than the American Navy, but with the Japanese Navy, it was even more vastly bigger. So the Americans insisted, in order to have the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, Britain had to abrogate the treaty with Japan, which mortally offended the Japanese, and I don't blame them, to be honest.
yeah.
So the mere fact that Britain was a potential enemy of Japan was down to the Washington Naval Treaty, which is whereby Britain accepted this, the Americans having parity with the Royal Navy, which they couldn't have achieved at all easily in 1922 without Britain doing that and scrapping like scores of dreadnoughts. So we accepted that, and that made Japan our enemy. And the Royal Navy very quickly realized that, you know what, Britain's going to end up fighting Japan in the Far East, and were preparing the Royal Navy for that. What they were not able to prepare the Royal Navy for, because it was impossible, was for fighting Germany, Italy, and Japan at the same time. Now, as I said earlier, Germany did not have a particularly big navy. You know, people will go on about Bismarck and all this sort of stuff, but, you know, they had 2 Bismarck-class battleships. They had 2 slightly smaller 11-inch battleships, and then they had this so-called, in air quotes, pocket battleships, which were actually heavy cruisers with 11-inch guns. And the Royal Navy was able to deal with all that stuff relatively easily. Poor old HMS Hood, who had not been modernized, was sunk by the Bismarck. But like Bismarck didn't live much longer after that. You know, the Royal Navy killed her very successfully. Italy had a pretty powerful navy in the Mediterranean, which meant that Britain had to have quite a lot of ships there. And that meant there wasn't much to be sent to the Far East. And of course, Winston Churchill, the wonderful conservative, when he wasn't a liberal patriot, who absolutely destroyed the British Empire he did more to destroy the British Empire than any other single man in history. Winston Churchill, of course, was always quite convinced Japan wouldn't attack at all. And so instead of sending modern British Hurricane and Spitfires fighter planes to the Far East, or even sending any British modern tanks to the Far East, he loaded them on Arctic convoys and got huge numbers of both merchant and Royal Navy British sailors killed, taking them to Stalin. And Stalin didn't even use many of them. In fact, I read an account by one Royal Navy officer who visited Archangel in, I'm not sure if it was the end of 42 or earlier in 43, but he said there were scores of rotting Spitfires in Archangel that the Russians, the Soviets, didn't even use. You know, meanwhile, of course, and the British garrisons in the Far East, in Malaya and Burma and India and all the rest of it, and also, of course, the Australians in Australia and New Guinea, they had no Spitfires and no Hurricanes because, you know, Japan wasn't going to attack, according to the genius Winston Churchill. Then he came out with this idea of sending HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse to the Far East, and they were supposed to have an aircraft carrier go with them. And unfortunately, the one aircraft carrier that was available ran aground in an accident and couldn't accompany them. But you also have to remember, even when you're looking at that situation, the reason there was only one Royal Navy carrier available to go to the Far East with Force Z, which was Prince of Wales and Repulse, the reason there was only one carrier available was because at the very start of World War II, Winston Churchill, when he became First Lord of the Admiralty, he stopped all of the construction on all British capital ships, which is to say battleships and carriers, in order to make more escorts. But in fact, the Royal Navy were already making more escorts, and he didn't need to do it. And it made no difference, really. All it did was delay big and powerful British aircraft carriers and also battleships coming into service by about 2 years, certainly by 18 months. But that was also good old Winston's contribution to World War II. I always say Winston Churchill got more Royal Navy sailors killed in World War I and World War II than any other single man.
I mean, Pearl Harbor happened on the 7th. Immediately at the same time, or near about the same time, you had the attack on Hong Kong, and by January, so the a month later, the Japanese had already gone to the interior of Malaya. They had invaded Thailand, and because remember they invaded southern Thailand, and the Thai king basically became a puppet near enough.
Well, they took over. They took over French Indochina because, of course, French Indochina by that stage was Vichy.
Yeah.
So semi-allied with the Germans.
Yeah, I mean, they
from there they occupied Thailand. I mean, I don't think you can say they invaded it. Like Thailand just went along with it pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there was any fighting. I mean, and also did the Philippines as well, because you had the attacks on the Americans at Wake and Midway, and at the start of that, and of course, the overrun of Malaya, the invasion into Burma, and of course the famous, I guess the most humiliating defeat for the British was the fall of Singapore, where you had on the 15th. 130,000 British, Indian, Australian, and Dutch. A few Dutch personnel became prisoners of war.
It was the biggest defeat in British history. And you have to some degree, blame Winston Churchill, because when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 20s and 30s, he refused to build more defences in Singapore, and then claimed in his books that were published post-World War II, oh, I never realised that Singapore wasn't this wonderfully strong fortress. But he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the guy who controlled the purse strings, who stopped Singapore from being turned into a real fortress.
And of course, IronDuke, a few days after the fall of Singapore, you had the bombing of Darwin in Australia.
Yeah, sometimes called the Australian Pearl Harbor, which is not really correct because not many warships were destroyed in Darwin. But yeah, absolutely. One thing I have to say right up front is that one of the interesting things about World War II is that the first Allied people, the first Allied men to defeat the Germans on land were the Australians at Tobruk in the Middle East, and the first Allied men to defeat the Japanese on land were again the Australians in New Guinea, and some of them were even the same blokes who were transferred from the Middle East to New Guinea.
Yeah,
like the final stop to the Japanese advance in New Guinea, and for anyone who doesn't understand, New Guinea in World War II was a Japanese colony, as it was up until the early 1970s. Some of the guys were transferred from the Middle East back to New Guinea because the Australians, understandably, were a bit scared they were going to be invaded by the Japanese, which actually was very unlikely, really, because Japan did not have enough troops to do it. But the Australian soldiers transferred from the 8th Army to New Guinea were the first guys who actually really stopped the Japanese and defeated them in New Guinea on the Kokoda track.
Yeah. I was going to say in March, the Japanese occupied Rangoon. There was a hasty withdrawal by the British, and I believe it was the retreat was to basically defend the central Burma, and it was you had an Indian and Burmese divisions holding the Irrawaddy River Valley. I think also the Chinese expeditionary forces were present. in this as well, and this was when you had the full-on retreat where the British were encircled, and the retreat into I guess out of Burma into India as it is now. Imphal became the point of the British retreat, and of course in this a lot of Brits and Australians and Indians and such were captured or killed. And as I mentioned, IronDuke, before in this, my grandfather's who was out in Burma at the time and India, and his brother was also out there, and his brother was captured in 42. I think it was about March time.
Sounds about right. In Burma, yeah, that would be about right.
Yeah. He was the one that was they captured, and he worked on the Burma Railway.
That was the longest retreat in British military history, by the way, was the retreat in Burma into India. It was the longest retreat in British military history.
Yeah, and back then, like today, there's not that many roads. It's thick, thick jungle, and it was very difficult terrain to move in, especially if you especially the sort of if you weren't properly equipped for it.
I think it's worth also pointing out that Harry Flashman makes a good point in the chat about the ad hoc modernization of the Indian Army. Yeah, it expanded hugely, which made it much weaker because, like the good officers and NCOs, there weren't enough to go around. That's absolutely true, Harry Flashman. But what also made it worse was that Churchill didn't really care about the war in the Far East. Churchill was obsessed with beating the Germans, and he, even at the cost of the destruction of Britain, which was the actual cost of it, certainly of the British Empire. He wasn't really interested in the Far East, and he didn't ever really support the war in the Far East until right at the end in 1945, when, of course, he was kicked out, mainly because most of the soldiers didn't vote for him. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen, most of the British soldiers, sailors, and airmen were sick of Winston Churchill and his warmongering by this stage, and they didn't vote for him. So,
Yeah.
But he was obsessed with being Germany. He didn't really care about the Far East. His only interest in the Far East was, that'll make the Americans come and help us. But of course, the Americans only came and helped us to the extent that the Americans wanted to come and help us and could use the British guys for their own ends. Britain by 1944 was more or less an American military colony, thanks to Winston Churchill, who was, of course, half American, I might add. But there we go.
Yeah, one thing that's been really interesting looking at these officers and as you mentioned, like General William Slim and these other figures that we'll be getting onto, is you had like the politicians and this. So we even the Australian Prime Minister at the time, what was his name, John Curtin?
Yeah, the Australian drunk Prime Minister at the time. Yeah, Labour guy.
Yeah, who basically said, we look to America and everything. This was in response to the fall of Malaya and Singapore and all that sort of stuff. And we look to America as our.
I've got to say, he actually didn't write that. His deputy did, because he was somewhere else when that was going on. People often say Curtin wrote that "We Look to America" stuff. He didn't. It was his deputy. But the one person I don't like who Churchill didn't like is Curtin. I'm not very keen on Curtin, I've got to say. But anyway, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a scummy thing to say, bearing in mind how many Australians were also captured.
Yeah, but I mean,
it seems like a real scummy thing.
As we will point out later on in this stream, the largest Royal Navy fleet in World War II was the British Pacific Fleet, which, if the invasion of Japan had gone ahead in 1945, would have had 16 aircraft carriers. That's the British fleet would have had 16 aircraft carriers. And that was based in Sydney Harbour in Australia. That was the forward base for that fleet. So, don't get the Australians wrong. They were more than happy to, when the Brits did have some forces to send their way, they were quite happy to have them based in Australia. But
yeah. So I was going to say, do you want to do in chronological? I mean, if we're doing chronological order, shall we talk about the Australians in New Guinea and what was happening down there?
Well, I think the main thing to realise about the Australians in New Guinea, as I said, was the guys who had some of them were what the Australians called chocos, which were part-time soldiers, right? And they did quite well against the Japanese, actually, if you go and look at their record. They fought pretty well, given that they started life as part-time soldiers, a bit like Territorial Army in Britain, that sort of thing. But then the Australian divisions from the Middle East were sent back to Australia and very rapidly sent to New Guinea. And those guys stopped the Japanese dead, because they were very tough soldiers who had already defeated Rommel's panzer troops in Tobruk and places like that. And so they had not a great deal. I mean, it was a hard campaign because the terrain and the weather were awful. But those Australian regular troops from the Australian Imperial Force were very rapidly able to defeat the Japanese in New Guinea. MacArthur, who was appointed Supreme Allied Commander and was a bit of an asshole, to be honest with you, didn't like the Australians and didn't trust them. But actually, the Australians performed better than most of the American troops did. But there we go.
No, and so I was just going to say, so yeah, we talk about the from my understanding, because as I say, I don't know about the Papua New Guinea campaign all too well. The only thing I know from that is the death toll on New Guinea of the Japanese. It was quite high. It was like 127,000.
Yeah, they ran out of supplies, mate. We were able to cut off their supplies. A lot of Japanese soldiers died of starvation and what have you. Same thing happened in Burma, by the way, because the Japanese supply arrangements were often not very good. And the old saw that amateur people talk about tactics and strategy, and professional military guys talk about logistics. Well, there is some truth to that, and Japanese logistics were often not very good. So yeah.
Well, as we'll find out with Imphal and Kohima.
Absolutely right. They were depending on capturing British supply bases, which they couldn't do. So, yeah.
No. And then the British figured they figured that out as well at the time. Or William Slim sort of thought that was he figured that out, that the supply lines wouldn't hold, and that's why he sort of just did the entrenchment routine, keep the high ground.
Could I just say that Bill Slim, Field Marshal Sir William Slim, who was the best British general of World War II, and I include Montgomery in that, who I'm not a big fan of, but Bill Slim started life as a Gurkha, a British Gurkha officer, and he actually fought at Gallipoli with the Gurkhas. alongside the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzac. That's where he started his career as a lieutenant. Yeah.
So the war in New Guinea began with the capture of the city of Rabaul. Is it Rabaul?
No, that's an island, mate. That's an island.
Is that an island?
Yeah, it's an island. It was a Japanese naval base.
Yeah.
Eventually.
So so that was the start of the attack. Yeah, Northern Tip, New Britain. That was it, New Britain. And we had that was it. Then you had Simpson Harbour. And it was the Japanese 8th Army under General Hitisho Amamuri.
Don't ask me about pronunciation of Japanese names, mate. I'm not going to help you there. But I would say this. Look, today, AI, if you're an Aussie or if you're a Brit who wants to go and do it, you can go on a hike over the Kokoda Track, which is where the Australians fought the Japanese in New Guinea. And it's over a lot of pretty high mountains with loads of mud and rainforest and very steep slopes and tracks that you're going to slip down if you're not careful. And like, it's something I would recommend people to go and do because, you know, if you can go and hike the Kokoda Track, it's kind of a blokey thing to do these days. But you have to understand that fighting the Japanese on the Kokoda Track would be like 5 levels above that rather than just walking it. Just walking it is kind of a blokey thing to do now, today, in 2024. But in World War II, these guys were doing it and also fighting the Japanese at the same time.
Yes. I'd be more worried that I get eaten by the locals, to be honest.
No, the locals were solidly on the Australian side. As I said earlier, New Guinea was an Australian colony at the time. And funnily enough, when the Japanese landed, they started like using flamethrowers on entire families of New Guinea natives. And the New Guinea natives, surprise, because the Australians never ever did that. You know, they didn't. All became what the Australians at the time referred to as fuzzy wuzzy angels, because they were bearers who were carrying their wounded down the track, etc. But you know, if the Japanese hadn't used flamethrowers on whole New Guinea families, who knows? It might have been different. You can't tell, can you? But strange to say, Australians never did that to New Guinea families. Being good, like Anglo-Celtic white guys.
Yeah. Mentioning the Kokoda Track, because that I got a quote here from Samuel Eliot Morrison, Breaking Bismarck's Barrier, and it's so this is the quote: "The Aaron Stanley Range is a jagged, precipitous obstacle covered with tropical rainforest up to the pass of 6,500 foot elevation, with moss like a thick wet sponge up to the highest peaks, 13,000 feet above the sea. The Kokoda Trail was suitable for splayed toed Papuan Aborigines, but a torture to the modern soldier carrying heavy equipment."
Sounds right to me, man.
And Buna was easily was taken.
It was called bloody. It was called Bloody Buna AI because so many Australian and also some American soldiers were killed there. It was called Bloody Buna. Because the Japanese, to give them their due, almost always fought to close to the last man. So
Yeah, and the Japanese objective and their main goal in all this was to seize Port Moresby, and it was to cut off the Australians and the Americans, and depending on who you believe, a launch pad to invasion of Australia. But to be honest, I don't even see that happen. That as a credible thing.
my view on that AI is that if the Japanese had, say, landed at Cairns, let's say, right, the roads were like, I've been all around that part of Australia in the early 2000s, and even in the early 2000s, many of the roads are dirt roads. They're not tarred. And the Japanese could never have got very far south. It just wouldn't have been possible. They didn't have enough troops for one thing.
I think it would be more likely that they would try and bomb more cities in Australia, if I was absolutely honest.
Well, they bombed Darwin many times. They bombed Thursday Island on the Torres. Sorry, not Thursday Island. They bombed the other island next to Thursday Island, where the airfield was, many times. But they weren't really capable of invading Australia. I don't think myself.
No.
And had they done so, they wouldn't have got very far, because there were just no communications from the far north of Australia, like the top end. There were very few usable communications down to the south. I don't think they got far at all. But you can understand the Australians being worried about that, of course. But in fact, their soldiers pretty much stopped that in New Guinea.
Yeah. So by September of 17th September 1942, the Japanese had reached the village of Lorbewawa. Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize for the pronunciations of these places. I'm assuming how it's pronounced. About 20 odd miles from the Allied aerodrome at Port Moresby. The Australians here held, entrenched in, and even managed a counterattack on the 26th. And going back to Samuel Elliott Morrison, the Japanese retreat down. He quoted saying the Japanese retreated down the Kokoda track had turned into a complete rout. Thousands perished from starvation, disease. The commanding general, Horai, was drowned in the rout, in the panic. Thus, the overland threat of Port Moresby was permanently removed, and that was that one is large. That was kind of that was when your general's killed and your army is somewhat decimated through the fighting and the natural elements. I mean, that's a pretty. I mean, that's a total wipeout near enough. I mean, there's no other way of describing it.
It was a very big failure. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah. Should we go on to Burma now? The
longest retreat in British military history. Yeah, we did that. We retreated
did that.
right back into India. Many disasters on the way, partly, once again, because Winston Churchill was not willing to send anything to the Far East. Because he was obsessed with beating the Germans in the Middle East, because he was. And longest retreat in British history, we had to retreat right back into India from Burma. And then in 1943, we tried to do some limited offensives into a place called Arakan in Burma, which was a very jungly, marshy, swampy rainforest area. And they did. And to cut a long story short, they didn't go very well. To be honest, they really didn't. Again, almost no British tanks, and the tanks that Churchill was willing to send there were crap. All the best British tanks were still being sent to Stalin and the Soviets via the Arctic convoys. And the same with British fighter aircraft and fire bombers and all the rest of it. All the best stuff was being sent and given away to the Soviets under Churchill. Nothing really modern was being sent to the Brits in the Far East. So Arakan in 1943 turned out to be like very unsuccessful, to be honest.
And so because in early 1944, you had the, I guess you could say, reorganization of the British 14th Army, this is where we get into Field Marshal William Slim here. And General George Gifford as well, and I think it was George Gifford said that one of the first things they had to do was strive. It was improving the health, the training, and the morale of the British and Indian units. Apparently they were quite sickly. You had frequent outbreaks of malaria, dysentery.
It was a very unhealthy place to fight a war. Especially like in the 1940s when medicine was less advanced than it is today. It was a very unhealthy place to fight a war. You got to say that it was. I think we've got to mention Ord Wingate and the Chindits. Now, Ord Wingate, I have my issues with, partly because he was a Zionist, and I'm certainly not. And he was also a bit mad. He really was a little bit mad. But Ord Wingate's Chindits, who were British and Gurkha soldiers, they were all British or Gurkha soldiers, who were organized as kind of commandos, I guess you'd say. And they did operations behind Japanese lines. I don't actually think he did the war much good. But what he did do was prove that British and Gurkha soldiers could operate behind Japanese lines and be better than the Japanese soldiers. In other words, the British and Gurkha troops could operate in the jungles better than the Japanese did. That's the one thing he did prove. And for that, I think we owe him a little bit of a debt. But like I said, he was a bit insane apart from that. But
And that was what my grandfather was mainly up to. He was commanding Gurkhas in Burma itself for a large part of the war. So
there's a good book by, I can't remember the author, AI, but I'm sure you all know him. There's a good book by a bloke who was a Chindit, and it's called Beyond the Chinwin River. The Chinwin being a river. And it's a good book about the Chindits and their first, I think it's their first operation, where they went like way behind Japanese lines and proved British.
Is it Bernard Ferguson?
Yeah, that sounds right, mate. Yeah, I think so. Bernard Ferguson. He was also a Chindit officer.
Yeah.
But those guys, what they did do was they proved that British soldiers and also Gurkha soldiers could go behind Japanese lines, operate in really thick rainforest jungle, and actually beat the Japanese. So from that point of view, it was good. But I'm not a huge old Wingate fan, him being a Zionist and also insane as far as I'm concerned. But,
I mean, it's funny. I remember my grandfather telling me about when he was in the jungles with the Gurkhas, that his he also had like a handful of um I guess you could say like native Burmese, like from a nearby tribe or like
Hmm.
nearby village, who were again, like we are saying about the Papua New Guinean lot, were loyal to the British. The Japanese also dished out very, very nasty brutality against the populace there. And uh, yeah, I mean they acted as guides. They did booby traps. Um, and on one occasion, the Gurkhas saved my grandfather's life in a very close call uh, firefight. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean it's very, very excellent. And um, I the only thing I was to think about is apparently the what was it, the um I think it was Christmas Day. When was it? Maybe 43 or 44. I can't remember now. Um, the the only thing that they could scavenge for for the meat for a Christmas meal was a peacock, and yeah, they killed like a couple of peacocks,
I can believe
and
that.
yeah, um, and the Gurkhas did the sort of plucking and all that sort of stuff. Apparently, they're very good at it. So that's a bit of
I can believe that, man.
side information there.
No, I can definitely believe that. I mean, to to bring us up to I don't know, the strategic level, shall we say, Winston Churchill, and in this case, quite rightly, wanted the Brits to invade Malaya. In 44, he wanted the Brits to invade Malaya and take it back off the Japanese. And in that case, he was quite right, of course, because that's what the British Empire needed to do. But the Americans were completely against this idea because one of the American war aims in World War II was to destroy the British Empire. So that wasn't going to happen. They were going to make sure that there were no American aircraft or landing ships or anything available for the British to do that.
No.
Therefore, Field Marshal Slim had no choice but to launch a land campaign through Burma to try and take it back. But before he could do so, the Japanese, who, although they were losing in the Pacific by this stage, still had very large numbers of troops in mainland Asia, were able to attempt their invasion of India, which was what led to the Battle of Imphal Kohima. Or actually, I should say the various battles. Excuse me.
The Japanese general at the time, Masakusa Kawabe, I think it was, he was under the impression that if they could invade India and capture Bengal, then in Calcutta, it would trigger an uprising in India, which would force the
That's
British
what they
out of
were
this.
hoping. Yeah, that's definitely what they were hoping for. Yeah. So
And
they attacked the British positions. Just I beg your pardon, guys. I got a bit of a cold. They attacked the British positions on the border of India from Burma, and the thing was that they had very large numbers of troops. And hang on. Sorry, guys, I've got a cold.
That's what I'll do. I'll do a bit. So so the Battle of so what began in March of 1944, or as I say, just leading up to this, is that General Slim looked at where everything was placed, and he noticed that Imphal, flat plateau, 6 airfields around the city, and realized, because of course this was the entrance for Burma, the one road into Burma and then out into the rest of India. So there was obviously that importance and obvious importance for the Japanese. And one thing that he was able to do was get radar. Spitfires were also brought at this time. Aircraft was brought, and you also had forward medical, like the medical side of it, the sort of logistics side was somewhat taken out of Calcutta and moved closer to Imphal, so there wasn't risk of supply shortage, which was a quite sensible move. And so the attack happened on the 8th of March. This was part of Operation Hugo, which includes the Battle of Imphal and Kohima, as we will see, and there's many others fights along the way. And start with here, you had 4 infantry divisions of the British Army. You had the British and Indian Army, 1 armored brigade and 1 parachute brigade, but the parachute brigade, I believe, was brought in just after the fighting through the airfield. On the Japanese side, you had 3 infantry divisions, 1 tank regiment, and also something which I will mention briefly, IronDuke, is the 2 Indian regiments. So you had this fellow called Subhasi Bose.
Oh yeah,
who was like
the Indian Traitor Army. Yeah.
the traitor army. I've so IronDuke, this is from Grandpa's diary. He so he claims, I don't know how this might have been propaganda at the time, but he claims that a lot of those Indians who joined up were basically used as basically carrying supplies.
Oh yeah. No, look, the Indian Traitor Army, which was the Indian National Army that you will now see so-called Indian nationalists going on about. This is what not only the British but also the Gurkha and Indian soldiers all refer to them as the Indian Traitor Army. By Sudra Bose, who was someone who was so anti-British, he was much happier to see like Japanese guys who would murder Indians without even a thought about it, rather than like backing the Brits, who would never do that, by the way. But yeah, Sudra Bose was a scumbag, and the Indian National Army were scumbags. That's the only way to describe them. But as I said, all of Field Marshal Slim's army called them the Indian Traitor Army, and that included the Indians. They all called them that at the time. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
They were also not very good. They would run away pretty easily.
I mean, the modern Indian governments celebrate him, his legacy and everything to the hilt.
Of course they do.
Yeah.
Of course they do.
How many actually joined? I mean, how many actually joined up in Indians, because I can't actually find a number of Indians who
so
these
far as
Indian
I can
traitors.
work out, quite a small minority of Indian prisoners of war joined Sundra Bose and his so-called Indian National Army. Quite a small number. It wasn't. It was certainly nowhere near 50%. You know, nowhere near.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say that again.
And the British and Gurkha and Indian soldiers who actually fought the Japanese to try and defend India, they despised them, and I think quite rightly.
Yeah. No, and so the battle started on the 8th of March, which was a week earlier than William
Against
Smith believed.
against the mostly Gurkha airborne brigade, yeah.
Yeah, it was happened earlier than he expected, and
but this is why, of course, it's forgotten AI. It's because this battle started just before D-Day and came to its climax just after D-Day. So nobody was paying any attention to it at all. This is why the greatest British battle of World War II, which is specifically the Battle of Kohima, is like unknown by most British people.
Yeah.
If you're going to ask me the hardest fought, best, most British battle of World War II, of the whole of World War II, which, by the way, like World War II was not one of the British Army's shining hours. It wasn't. British troops fought far harder and far better in World War One. Far harder and far better, generally. But the one British battle in World War II that I will say, yeah, this was like Brits fighting like Brits. You know, like if you're going to look at, battles like, I don't know, Waterloo or let me think of Agincourt. If you're going to look at a British battle, which was something similar to that, it's the Battle of Kohima, because it was just one British battalion, the 4th Royal West Kent Regiment. That was the greatest British battle of World War II by quite some way, if you ask me.
Yeah, and I mean, it has been described by many, even at the time, contemporary time, as the Stalingrad of the East.
Yep.
Given the death toll of it and and everything else, I mean, yes,
smaller
absolutely,
scale,
I can see that.
Smaller scale than Stalingrad, but then everything was smaller scale than Stalingrad. So I mean,
Yeah. So on the 8th, let's say, the Japanese troops crossed the Chindwin River on the 8th of March. General Scoons gave his forward divisions orders to withdraw to Imphal only on the 13th of March, which some believe the decision to withdraw was actually saved the division.
maybe.
Because of the risk of encirclement, because the withdrawal to Imphal meant that it was a flat plain, flat plateau, made it difficult for the Japanese to well, they were more entrenched as well. It made it really difficult for the Japanese to attack that position. The 20th Indian Division held Tamu near the Chindwin and Mori a short distance to the north, where you had a supply depot which had been set up. And then you had
there was a pretty important road junction at Imphal as well. Sorry, at Kohima. There was a pretty important road junction there. And there was some confusion.
We will get on.
At first, there was some confusion because if you listen to officers and men who fought there, and there's a good documentary you can find on YouTube about the Battle of Kohima. If you look at the guys who fought there was some confusion, like they were sent there, they were withdrawn, then they were sent there again. So there was a bit of confusion there. But in the end, the 4th Royal West Kent Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Laverty, who was an excellent Lieutenant Colonel and commander of his battalion, they were the main defense of Kohima.
Yes. And on 20th of March, you had 6 Lee medium tanks of the 3rd Carabinieri and the 6 Type 95 Hago tanks leading Yamamoto's started to advance up from the south, which wasn't expected. The expectation of the attack would be from the east, so it was a bit of a, I guess you say, a bit of a surprise. Was it General Douglas Gracie was opposed to making a decision of any retreat, but he was later ordered to detach some of his division to provide reserves for the 4th Corps. This left as I mentioned, the Indian regiment at Tamu and Moi in a weaker position to hold their bit, so that they withdrew into Shenham Saddle, which is makes sense because if you actually, I had a look on Google Maps earlier, and it's like a very narrow ravine valley. And I think the idea was, well, if Japanese are coming along there, we can just, they'll be forced into a narrow position. You can just like pick them off.
The real point, AI, is that a whole Imperial Japanese division, which was about 15,000 men, arrived outside of this British defended town, and its defenders were the 4th Royal West Kent Regiment, which was about 800 dudes, a couple of companies of Gurkhas, and a few platoons of Indians. And that was the whole of the defense. Yes, there were other Allied soldiers there, but they were almost all like rear echelon dudes who had maybe fired their rifle half a dozen times. So this whole Imperial Japanese division that was arriving at Kohima, the defense was one single British battalion, the 4th Royal West Kent, under Lieutenant Colonel Laverty, and as I said, a couple of companies of Gurkhas and a few platoons of Indians. That's what they were facing. These guys were outnumbered at least 10 to 1. I think that's something you have to realize. There's a reason I say that the Kohima was the greatest British battle of World War II, and it was because we were seldom outnumbered so much by like good troops. These Japanese soldiers were good, experienced soldiers. They weren't crap at all.
No, and the 17th Indian Division was also cut off by the Japanese 33rd Division. This was further south.
To let people understand in the chat, which I'm sure is difficult, like Imphal Kohima was a series of battles, and Imphal, which is what AI is talking about at the moment, there were several British divisions which were briefly cut off, but briefly, not for long. The real crisis was at Kohima, because at Kohima there was only one British battalion there and a few Gurkha and Indian guys, not many at all, and they were being attacked by an entire Imperial Japanese division, which is like 9 battalions of infantry, plus quite a lot of artillery, and and they even had tanks, you know. So
Yeah. And yeah, I was going to say, I believe an Indian battalion in the between Kohima and Imphal was wiped out by the Japanese. They were overrun.
I think the Japanese overran quite a lot of British and Indian soldiers, but overall they didn't, which is why they lost. One of
Yes.
Bill Slim's things was, if you can make the Japanese attack you by cutting off their supplies or by us supplying you by air, you can beat them. And of course, he was right about that. But the fighting in Kohima was so close.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get on to the Battle of Kohima now, and just for people where this all takes place within at the time it was obviously British India, but it was the Assam Principality.
Yeah, he was right on the edge of India. He was right on the edge of India. Yeah, it was the far, I don't know how you would describe it. I suppose you'd say it was the northeast frontier of India. And it was very hilly, and the tribes there were not your typical Indians at all. Like the British commissioner who refused to leave, like they wanted him to leave before the siege, and he said, no way, I'm not leaving all these local, I think they're called the Naga people.
Naga people, that's right. Yeah.
I think that's the people of Imphal. They're the Nagas, who are a pretty ancient hill tribe, I guess you would describe them. And the Nagas provided the British district commissioner with like a bodyguard of like, I don't know, 20 guys with spears, basically. No, they had spears when the Japanese attacked with their rifles and machine guns and mortars and all the rest of it. Yeah, the British commissioner had a bodyguard of like 24 guys with spears. And the British commissioner said, no, I'm not leaving because these are my people. Because, you know, the British used to look after their people back in the day. He had a nice bungalow, and it had a tennis court. And the thumbnail for this stream is the Battle of the Tennis Court, because at one stage the Brits were on one side of the tennis court and the Japanese were on the other side of the tennis court. So if you ever watch Wimbledon or the Australian Open or something like that, you can imagine the Japanese on one side, Brits on the other side. That's how close they were. And they were fighting hand to hand. Like, because they were so close, loads of guys would get killed by machine gun and rifle fire and grenades, but you would inevitably get guys fighting each other with bayonets, you know. That's how close the fighting in Kohima was. And like I say, the British commissioner, who was a guy in his late 40s at that stage, he just said, no, I'm not leaving, I'm going to stay. And he did.
Yeah. And also, I believe this is the one towards the end of the battle, because the battle went on from April to June. So this was like quite drawn out.
Quite a long time,
And of course, as we mentioned, you had one infantry brigade, but then at the end you had two infantry divisions, a Chindit's brigade and the motor brigade, coming in as reinforcements.
Oh yeah, they were relieved eventually, but it took weeks before the relief came up. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I believe my grandfather was within that relief effort at the time. So
Yeah, no, absolutely,
diary.
mate. But the 4th Royal West Kents under Lieutenant Colonel Laverty, they held Kohima for 4 weeks on their own against the whole Japanese division. Yeah, all right, there were a couple of companies of Gurkhas who helped them, and like Gurkhas are some of the greatest soldiers in the world, and there were a very few platoons of Indians who helped them, but basically it was the 800 odd guys of the 4th Royal West Kent Regiment who held off a whole Imperial Japanese division on their own, which is why I think that was the greatest British World War II battle of all for the British Army. It was where the British Army really lived up to its reputation, and they were outnumbered way over 10-1. They really were.
Well, actually, to give the numbers, so at the start, the infantry brigade from the British side was under Montague Stopford, was 1,500. The Japanese division that they were against was anywhere between 15,000 to 20,000. And bearing in mind the Japanese, and this one I'm going for my grandfather because he was got his diary here. So what he says is that when there was the counterattack, so when there was the push by the British, so this is like towards the end, he said that as soon as he was going up this hillock, as he calls it, he saw Indian. This is the relief when you had the relief, and he said you had the Indian and British fighting effectively hand in hand in what the Japanese defensive positions. And one of them, he actually says that he saw, and he told me this story, was he saw the Japanese officer with his sword run through a British soldier.
I believe that.
And was the officer was quickly shot. I believe he shot at him.
He wouldn't survive long.
Yeah, because he was armed with his pistol at the time in the assault. But yeah, I mean, he said that there was effectively the Japanese. What makes this particularly is that when they realized they were in retreat, their officers would sort of try and gather up the men and do these, as we famously know, the banzai charges, and they would just do these suicidal charges, time and time again. And hence why they had such a heavy casualty rate. But also one thing that important to mention is that the death of from disease and starvation, because in all the campaign, the Yugo campaign, so Imphal and Kohima, that all overshadows, is the Japanese failed to organize and logistic wise, because they were doing quick dashes like they did at the start of the Pacific War against the British.
They were depending on capturing British supply bases, which they were not able to capture.
No, they weren't, and that's what Slim knew, and that's why he. It was basically he knew that this would be the best way to starve them out, and I mean they slaughtered all their ox and donkeys and what else, and of course this was in the end this was a notable defeat. This was a pretty major defeat, and
it wasn't just notable. The defeat the Japanese were given by the British 14th Army, the Forgotten Army, because D-Day was going on and all this, and no one gave a shit about what was going on in Burma. But the defeat that the British 14th Army gave the Japanese was the largest defeat the Imperial Japanese Army on land ever had.
Well, that's what I was going to say, was that, you know, when you think about all the, you know, like the Battle of Saipan and Okinawa and all these
They were all
battles that are
small scale.
scale.
They were all small
Yeah.
scale compared to Burma. Yeah.
I mean, to give you the total death from this, 30,502 were dead, and then a further 23,000 were effectively rendered, you know, hospitalized. They were unable to, and that's not including the missing, which is about 2,000. So, I mean, you can, yeah, effectively, this was a huge defeat. I mean, the casualty on the British side was, I think, 16 to 21,000. I can't find the breakdown, like the between the actual like British forces and the Indian British forces. I can't actually find
very difficult to find them. Yeah, I agree. But yeah, it was
there's
a
an account.
huge defeat.
Sorry, Andrew. Yeah, sorry, Andrew. There is one book here that's suggests that the majority may have been the Indian, just because they made the Indians might the Indian and Burmese may have been the largest bulk, but I can't tell. Who knows?
Were they the largest bulk who actually fought there, mate? That's what I would argue. I don't think so myself, but you know what? I'm a bit biased. I'm an Englishman and a Briton, but I think the guys who won that war were mostly British, to be honest. That's what
I think at Kohima and at Kohima and Imphal, we know they were mainly British. A lot of the Indians were just put along the various hill and ridge lines to plug the gaps.
I mean, look, one of the things you need to realize is that an Indian, not you, but people in the chat need to realize, is that an Indian, in inverted commas, brigade was actually 2 Indian battalions and 1 British battalion, always. You know, an Indian brigade. There were a few totally Indian brigades in World War II, just because Winston Churchill was a wank. But generally speaking, the way the Indian army was organized was that if you had an Indian, in inverted commas, brigade, 2 of the battalions would be Indian and 1 would be British. That's the way it had been ever since the Indian Mutiny of 1857. And it didn't change.
No.
So an Indian division, in air quotes again, an Indian division in air quotes, Indian infantry division would have 6 Indian infantry battalions and 3 British infantry battalions.
Yeah.
So every time you hear of an Indian division did this or that or whatever,
it's not necessarily actually Indians.
A third of their soldiers were actually British. White Anglo-Celtic British guys from British battalions like the 4th Royal West Kent.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I mean, talk about the legacy from this defeat is that the Matucci, who was like the commander of who was like the head, I guess you say the field marshal in this, the Japanese field marshal in this campaign. He sacked all his division commanders who involved in the operation.
Don't blame him.
And then he was then sacked himself on the 30th of August. And the other general who was involved with the Imphal sort of disaster there for the Japanese was dismissed on health grounds because he sort of became quite frail and unwell as a result of the defeat. and it, as a result of this, there was like this restructure, and like a whole restructure of the command structure, but also how I don't want to, it's like military policy, you know, how they conducted, how the Japanese conducted
Hmm.
themselves when it came to like logistics. There was that, because this was, and somebody mentioned in chat, this wasn't the first, this wouldn't be like the first time the Japanese would I mean, we mentioned New Guinea, you know, again, logistics there failed them, you know, keeping the supply lines, and
Yeah, the
same thing
Japanese
happened
weren't very
in
good on
Guadalcanal.
logistics. That's true. Yeah, they weren't. Look, I would recommend a book. If you want to know what happened after, like Kohima and Imphal, there's an excellent book by George MacDonald Fraser, who is a great author. He's the guy who wrote all the Flashman books, which are excellent. Great history, by the way. Like, they're comedy books to some extent, but actually his history is faultless, mostly, George MacDonald Fraser. But he also wrote a biographical book about him fighting in Burma in 1945. And it's called Quartered Safe Out Here, which is a Kipling quote, by the way. But if you want to like know what it was like for the ordinary British soldiers fighting in Burma in 1945, go and read George MacDonald Fraser's Quartered Safe Out Here. It's a great book. I really love it. And yeah, he was a good guy. But yeah.
I mean, just to give I mean, again, I think I can't ever stress the absolute waste that the Japanese had in Burma. At the end of the war, you know, when the Japanese were forced out of Burma, and you know, the war came to the end. During the entire conflict in Burma, 200,000 Japanese were killed. Mainly, a good portion were, you know, disease,
Yeah,
death by wounds,
makes
that sort of
sense.
stuff. And then of course fighting. I mean, again, a big number makes up that the Yugo offensive there with Kohima and Imphal. That was a
Makes sense, mate. Makes sense. Look, the way I would like to finish this, if you're agreeable, AI, is
yeah.
let's
We'll
talk
finish it.
about the British Pacific Fleet. The British Pacific Fleet was the largest British Royal Navy fleet of World War II.
Yeah. So, do you want to? Because I'm not. So the commander was it Bruce Fraser?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, that was the guy who sank the Scharnhorst German battleship in 1943. I think it was 1943. With HMS Belfast, by the way, which is the ship you could still visit on the River Thames. HMS
Yeah,
Belfast.
I've been there. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've been there a few times. It's great.
she helped sink the Scharnhorst and fired on it. But yeah, Bruce Fraser was the admiral. Admiral Vian, who was in command of HMS Cossack, which was a Royal Navy destroyer that captured the Altmark. I think it was the Altmark that had all the prisoners from the Graf Spee on board, right? And so Altmark, the German merchant ship, was trying to sail all these prisoners back to Germany. And HMS Cossack, which was a British destroyer under Captain Vian, boarded her. And they went aboard with like bayonets and cutlasses and all this. And they were shouting out, "The Navy's here!" And all the British merchant prisoners from the Graf Spee were all saying, "We're down here," you know. that was one of the last great boarding actions in naval warfare, to be honest. But eventually, Vian became the he became the admiral of British aircraft carriers, and the British aircraft carriers who were operating off Japan in 1945, he was in charge of those, and there were 4 of them, mostly. Eventually, I think there were 6, but there were 4 of them mostly. And the thing about the British aircraft carriers operating off Japan is that when the Japanese kamikazes came and landed on their flight decks, crashed into their flight decks because they were suicide bombers. One American journalist who was on board a British aircraft carrier said, when the Japanese aircraft carriers, the Japanese kamikazes land on an American carrier, that means if the carrier survives, it's got to go back to Pearl Harbor for 6 months to be repaired. But when they land on a British carrier, which had an armored flight deck, it's get out on the brooms, and then the carrier is operational 3 hours later, which was true.
Yeah, I think it was HMS Victorious. It was quite literally the brooms come out, and there was somebody said, "Oh, it was a bit of a dent."
Yeah, they used to use a bit of concrete to get rid of the. They would put concrete down over the dent, and then it could just operate normally again.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's quite interesting because there only seems to be 3 attempts by the Japanese of kamikaze raids on. It was Indomitable, the Victorious, and Formidable.
But
Which
no. Look, AI, you have to understand there were innumerable attempts, but the Royal Navy fires shot most of them down, and then the Royal Navy guns shot even more of them down. There were innumerable. There weren't only 3, mate. Honest, that's there were loads, literally scores of Japanese attempts to attack Royal Navy aircraft carriers, but they were
seems
stopped
that the
by
Japanese
Royal Navy
target
fires
but
and by the guns.
Having said that, though, the Japanese did seem to mainly target their kamikaze on the American fleet. It does seem to be more focused on the American fleet.
Well, there were more American carriers than there were British carriers, so from that point of view, yeah. But in actual fact, they in proportion they did just as many attacks. But Royal Navy fires and Royal Navy guns shot down a lot of those Japanese attacks, And also, if you finally managed the carrier, because the Royal Navy carriers had armored flight decks, which, by the way, after World War II, the Americans adopted, they did less damage. But the idea there were only 3 attacks is ridiculous, mate. Sorry.
Well, that's what I was going off. That's what.
Yeah,
that was what the notes I was going. I was just going off the notes that I had here for that. So there was 3 major.
Yeah, there were scores and scores of attacks against Royal Navy aircraft carriers, but Royal Navy fires were actually pretty good, breaking up the enemy, and Royal Navy gunners were also pretty good at blowing them out of the sky. So yeah.
So one thing that isn't really talked about with the naval campaign is towards the end, literally towards the end, so July, August 1945 of the war here, you had the naval bombardment of the Japanese mainland, including it was 4 Japanese cities and military facilities and towns. I think it was the cities of Kamishi and Hitachi, something like that.
When you say naval bombardment, do you mean by guns or aircraft?
Well, with Kamishi, that was at warships.
Yeah, because British battleships absolutely did attack Japanese coastal towns with guns.
Yeah. Yeah, the British warships also bombarded or attacked Hamamatsu. I can't pronounce these places.
British battleships absolutely did do that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
I mean,
our carrier aircraft also attacked Japanese towns. We did. Is that good or bad? I don't know, but we did.
I mean, the unfortunate thing is there were like 32 Allied prisoners of war killed in these bombardments.
Well, what a surprise! What a surprise!
But yeah, it's of course this whole bit of the history was slightly overshadowed because, of course, at the same time the two atomic the bombs were dropped and over Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, look, there was an Allied plan which was called Operation Downfall.
Yes.
Basically, it was an American plan, really, to invade Japan. And had we done so, it was going to be in two parts. And the second part of it would have included a British Commonwealth Army Corps. Like the Australians, for example, insisted, and I do say insisted correctly, there would have been an Australian division involved. There would have been at least one and probably two British divisions involved. Would have been probably some New Zealanders, and obviously the British Pacific Fleet in that event, which would have been late 45 and early 46. Britain would have had 16 aircraft carriers off Japan, which would have been 25% of the Allied aircraft carriers. And the American admiral's opinion on this was that within a month of the fighting starting, the British might have had more operational aircraft carriers than the Americans did, because none of the American carriers at that stage had any armor. So, like, one hit anywhere on the flight deck was going to fuck you up, you know? Which, in the British case, it was like, get out the brooms, because they had several inches of armor on their flight decks, which later on the Americans adopted, because maybe the Brits were right, who knows? But yeah, had like the invasion of Japan happened, you would have had a British Commonwealth Army Corps landing near Tokyo, and the Japanese could have put 21 divisions into the field to defend Tokyo, which would have dwarfed anything else that ever happened in the war in the Pacific and the Far East.
Yeah.
And for that single reason, I'm not against the idea of dropping the atom bombs. Yeah. I don't think we needed that many casualties.
I mean, IronDuke, it's also important to remember that at the same time as well, in 45, after much begging, Stalin invaded or launched his offensive in Manchuria.
His useless invasion of what was it called? I'm trying to remember now.
Manchuria,
yeah. Stalin's useless invasion of Manchuria. Yeah, I remember that.
And also Korea as well, because he went as far as Korea as well. Sort of largely why we have the North-South Korea divide today.
Yeah, I love Stalin. He's such a good guy.
Yeah, and during all this, the Japanese holdings in China remained unchanged until their withdrawal after the surrender.
Absolutely right, mate. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
totally right. It didn't change at all. I mean, but there again, I'm not a China fan, but whatever. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the whole of the Far East War in World War II started because the Americans couldn't mind their own business about what Japan was doing in China. And you know what? I don't care what they were doing in China, really. That's my view. I like Japan could do what they like with China so long as they left the British bits alone, and I wouldn't have cared. I'm very pro-British, me. I really am. I'm very pro-British. I don't care. Like if Japan wanted to ruin whole areas of China, if they didn't touch anything that was British, I would have said, I don't care. I'm very strange like that, I guess. Or maybe I'm not strange and maybe I'm sensible. But,
the USS Indianapolis, that was what carried the atomic bombs, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Aubrey is making a good point. Because it was a secret mission, when it was sunk, I believe by a Japanese submarine, most of the guys got killed by sharks and stuff because it was secret. So no rescue ships were sent for ages. There you go, Aubrey. That's what that's about.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah.
The British contribution to the Pacific War was considerably more than is often realized. And like I said, the guys particularly at the best, in my opinion, like the best British soldiers in World War II were absolutely the guys at Kohima. They were outnumbered 10, 12 to 1 easy. And they didn't lose. They didn't. But of course, no one remembers them because they were doing this when D-Day was going on and no one gave a shit about what was happening in Burma. So
yeah, and also, I mean, again, after the war, you had the selling out of the British Empire, independence from India and the colonies, the decline of Britain, as we have been covering in the Richard Hilton book. And one thing that's incredible is that you had this unified feeling among many of the Indian veterans, the Burmese veterans, and the British veterans out there. My grandfather was one of them. Is that there was this I guess maybe when it was immediate after it was anger, and then a lot of them just forgotten. Because I remember a lot of the Burma veterans. I mean, my grandfather was one of them. When it wasn't until he reached his old age he actually ever talked about it. He just did. A lot of them didn't.
Is that the guy whose photograph you showed me, AI, with the very splendid moustache?
That's the one. Yeah.
Very, very splendid moustache, mate.
Yeah, he had a very, very good like. It's really funny because his when he first arrived in India in 42, he had a bit of a mid-century German moustache going on.
He didn't. No. You have to understand, AI, that Adolf babes copied British officers' moustaches, right? And that sort of moustache was very common in the First World War for British officers.
Yeah.
And it was Adolf who was doing the copying, not your grandfather.
I assume that because he had that moustache for
that was a First World War British officer's moustache, mate.
Yeah.
That's what Adolf copied.
I would have thought so. His uncle, his father, who was in the First World War in Gaza during the Battle of Gaza, and you had those sort of moustaches. But I mean, I was watching an interview with a lot, and the Indian one said that they felt betrayed by the British because they left. A lot of them felt like orphans. That was one phrase that was used quite a bit. That they were left, and then the Hindu nationalists took over, berated the, there was a big. I mean, even to this day, there's a lot of anti-British sentiment in and around Hindu nationalist circles. Same in Burma as well, because Aung San Suu Kyi's father was the Burmese collaborator with the Japanese, as well. And so when that, he took over as well, that again the same thing happened.
We're supposed to think she was a good girl. I don't.
But, no, it's a scumbag, family of scumbags, and so overall, and of course, unfortunately, because of the way that society went in the second half of the 20th century, there was a lot of, in academia and in society, anti-colonialism. There was a lot of, anti-empire sentiment.
I always thought it was a huge insult to the British soldiers, and also to some degree to the Gurkha and Indian soldiers, that within a couple of years after World War II, like Burma was given independence. So they must have fought. What on earth did we fight for?
Well, I mean, from one interview, one Burmese one, he didn't believe it. He thought that the British were coming back. He thought for years that the British would come back, that this was a temporary setback. They would come back and, things would carry on as normal. I mean, a lot of them couldn't accept it at first. I think it was like when you had your partition and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, ultimately, and someone said in my Twitter comments reply, they said it's a shame what happened, because of it kind of was all for nothing in that sense. I mean, given what happened afterwards, it was all for nothing. And
why fight so hard to take this place back, Burma, and then you give it independence in 1947 under, of course, Clement Attlee of the Labour Party. But
now
it's insane.
IronDuke, it's important to remember that Richard Hilton, in this, I believe he points the blame at certain elements of like American, like the American military press.
Might be true, but the British Prime Minister, who said, "All right, fuck off Burma," after so many British soldiers had been killed fighting for it. That was Clement Attlee of the Labour Party. Yes, it was.
Yeah. Richard Hilton. Richard Hilton just said it was a straight up betrayal. And he said that, he still stuck to the guns up until his death, that actually the majority of the support for Gandhi and the Indian National Congress and the Indian independence movement. Well, yeah, it was ridiculously overstated. In reality, the majority of people would rather stay, they would rather keep the status.
Look, we've also got to remember that Mountbatten, who was the last British Viceroy of India, his wife was busy fucking Nehru, who she was absolutely in love with. So, if I'd have been Mountbatten, I would have divorced her. But, Mountbatten was a bit of a cuck, and apparently was also a bit bi, but I don't know. Whatever. What can I say? You've got to tell the truth about these people. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it explains why a lot of these, especially these officer people, why they became because in the wake of this with Richard Hilton, you had the Empire League, which in the media at the time was described as like a neo-fascist organization, which is interesting, because I would have thought they,
because it wasn't. It was just it was a pro-British Empire League. That's what it was.
Well,
Okay.
I would have thought that, but at this time you had, I get what you would call the boomer truth. So they were starting to use the term
Oh yeah, yeah,
Nazi and
yeah.
fascist for everything at this point. This is when you
The
have like
guys
this
who joined the
60s and
British Empire League were most of the guys who joined the British Empire League were First World War soldiers or their wives and people like that, and some Second World War soldiers, and people like my grandfather who actually thought the British Empire was a good thing, which indeed it was, but you're not allowed to say that. Yeah.
Well, I think it was
You
also the
can't.
lies. It was also the lies that were told about it. I mean, as we know, we've gone over the countless times. It was deliberately wrecked behind the scenes. It was also wrecked by various elements in history.
Wrecked by Winston Churchill, who was actually
Yeah,
anti-British Empire, but yeah,
and also elements
true.
in the American elite and all that. And so
100%, 100%.
so there was. I mean, one thing that's quite interesting is Richard Hilton does talk about how American army journalists were sort of helping Gandhi in his movement and everything, which is weird because you would have thought our supposed allies in the war at the time you know wouldn't be trying to help revolts
We didn't
behind us.
have any allies, mate. Really,
No,
we didn't have any allies.
no.
You know what? I like some American people. There are many good Americans, but their government has never been a friend of Rome. Never.
I
Ever,
mean,
ever.
it has been constant. It has been like a massive backstab. Um,
Yeah,
it,
always, always, man, always.
it was like
Listen,
a
they
massive
did fight
constant.
a war of independence against us. So why is anyone surprised about that? And like I say, I'll say this again. I know many good Americans. I do. I've got American friends, including American military friends and American girls who I really like, but their government has never been a friend of Rome, ever.
Yeah,
Never,
I mean,
ever.
I would say that as we if Aubrey, if you want to actually see where our position is, because it might sound like it's
I leave
um
Aubrey alone. I know her. She's a good girl, but
no.
she's
If
a girl. So
I'm not going to say I'm not going to say anything horrible, but I was just going to say that if you want to understand our position, if you watch Adam Curtis's Oceans Apart,
much
that's
truth.
from the British position of what happened, like from the British perspective of what happened post-war and America and everything. And if you watch
Yeah.
that, you might understand why. I mean, because this is the thing, Aubrey, that the anti-American sentiment in the UK is largely within left-wing circles. It's usually like your George Galloways and people like that, right?
Yeah,
It's in the,
I would just say to Aubrey, do go and watch that. You can find it on YouTube easily.
it's all free on YouTube.
Go and watch that video called Oceans Apart. That does kind of it kind of does explain it. It really does. But look, I will also say Aubrey's a very old-fashioned American girl.
Yeah.
She's the daughter of a U.S. naval officer, and she ain't a bad person at all. Not at all. Like
I mean,
I'm rather fond of her, to be honest. But
yeah. No,
yeah, she doesn't totally get the
yeah.
UK American split. She doesn't.
I would say, Aubrey, that the most I'm going to say the American elite at the time, the sort of New England set in the Oceans Apart, I guess the ones you could say that were more. There seems to be that there was this emergence of anti-British sentiment, largely from, I think, and this is what they said was like the Irish immigrant, like the Irish immigrants, and there was a
Some
lot
truth.
of
Yeah, some truth.
there was that's probably where a lot of the hostility came from. Why you had certain Irish Americans in elite positions in the government and stuff, why there was sort of, I mean, JFK's father, who was the ambassador for London, was incredibly anti-British. He was incredibly anti-British. What was his name? Was it Joe Kennedy? IronDuke? Oh, I can't hear you, IronDuke. Yeah. I think IronDuke, I can't, if you're trying to talk, I can see the moving, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I remember in the Oceans Apart, Aubrey, that there was it showed like Irish, it was sort of like the waves. And it's quite interesting because when you had Irish immigrants that went to, say, commonwealth countries like Australia and such, you didn't have that same sentiment. But yeah, that's it's quite interesting. IronDuke, I think I've lost you. IronDuke, I've lost you. Or did you? Oh, you back? You? Sorry, I thought I lost you in.
Sorry, mate. I was doing something else. But yeah, is Aubrey taking over the chat? Stop it, girl. But anyway, yeah. If you want to look for the greatest British battle of World War II, you've got to look at Kohima. World War II was not the British Army shining hour, I have to say. There were various, like, very good and brave actions by the British Army, but compared to World War One, it's not all that great, to be honest. But the one exception is Kohima. That was a battle where the 4th Royal West Kents were outnumbered 10, 12 to 1 at least. And yeah, they didn't lose. So I would say that is one of the great British battles of World War II. And Field Marshal William Slim, I think he was the greatest British general of World War II. He was far better than Montgomery, who had many, many issues. But, so did many Allied generals. So whatever.
I mean, Montgomery was always sidelined by Patton. So, it was...
Well, the thing is, Montgomery made himself deliberately, I think, unpopular with Eisenhower.
Yes.
And I think that had an effect when Eisenhower was president in 1956. Britain was trying to do the Suez thing. I think that Eisenhower remembered Montgomery from then, and that was why he was so hugely anti-British, which he was.
What was Montgomery's thing, that he just didn't want to have to share command structure with Americans? Because I always felt that was a part of it.
I think he was just an arsehole, if you really want my opinion of the truth of Montgomery, I think he was a bit of an arsehole, to be honest. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong, but that's what I think. But it's like Churchill was an arsehole, no doubt, and also wasn't at all pro-British. I think Montgomery was probably more pro-British than Churchill, but that would not be very difficult,
Wasn't there an argument between Montgomery and Patton of like who gets to enter Rome first? There was something like really petty squabble.
I don't think it was Rome, because
it might have been Naples.
They've been moved by that stage, mate. What you're thinking of is General Mark Clark.
That's right.
One of the worst American generals of World War II, who was told by Alexander, who was the British commander-in-chief in Italy, you need to cut off the Germans because we're breaking through here and here. And what you need to do, because there was a British and American force who were attacking the Germans in Italy in 44, and 43 and 44. And Alexander, who was the British commander, who was not the brightest tool in the shed, he was an Irish guardsman. And, everyone in the British Army calls the guards TikToks because that's the noise they make when they march because of the steel things they put in their boots. And I was not a guardsman, by the way. But anyway, Alexander told Mark Clark to cut off the Germans because the British and the Americans had broken through a bit and the Germans had to retreat. But Mark Clark, because he was such a genius American moron, decided, no, what I'm going to do is capture Rome, because capturing Rome will give me a historical story, because, Rome is the ancient city of the world, And so he didn't cut off the Germans. They all managed to retreat, and thousands more British and American soldiers got shot trying to break through the next German line under Kesselring. But that was Mark Clark. Mark Clark was a moron, basically.
I think IronDuke, we're going to probably call it a night now because I'm getting a bit tired now. And
I don't blame you, mate. It's a depressing subject to talk about World War II in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, and I think we both got like a flu or something.
Look, even leaving aside like all the propaganda we've got since World War II, which has kind of made the world as bad as it is now. Looking at the military history of World War II is a pretty depressing thing to do, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, my final statement on this is I massively respect the soldier and the battalions and the units that fought in the way they did. I think that the only thing I could take away from that, it was an incredible feat that was done. And on the individual level, I think it was worthy to be remembered and celebrated.
100%, man. 100%. I agree with Morgoth when he slags off Spitfire nationalists. I think he's right when he does that. But I absolutely, as I just said, I totally respect the fighting men themselves who put their life on the line, risked life and limb. But they didn't do it for Jewish people. They didn't do it for gay people. They didn't do it for democracy. These guys in World War II who did the actual fighting were almost all entirely nationalist guys. They were guys who, if they'd been around today, would almost all be called, Nazis or something like that, because they were nationalist, pro their own country guys. Yeah, they were. They just all were. And those guys, I will celebrate. I will never celebrate scumbag traitors like Winston Churchill. Never, ever, ever. But the guys who actually did the fighting, they're worth remembering, because they were nationalist, right-wing guys who were mostly patriots. And you know what? They were all right. They were good people.
Yeah,
that's my
100%. 100%. Anyway, I'm going to call it a night now. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, man. I'm very, very happy you invited me on the stream.
Yeah, it's been great. No, it's been great to have you on. Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you, Melon, R. Patterson, and Harry Flashman, Aaron Hook as well, and Mediocre, the Unremarkable, and Royal Biscuits. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, IronDuke, and have a good night.
Same to you, mate. Go well.